Hi people, hope you're all well. I want to prefix this video with a few little points. Different locations, sometimes when I'm up late, it's half 3 a.m. now, I try to do the videos in this room because the other room would echo and other people in the building would them. Um, I'm not a Catholic. I come from an Anglican tradition. I was baptized as an Anglican. But I have genuine interest in the history of the Holy See. I must admit, I find it fascinating. I must admit that I find all the ceremony and the history there very, very interesting. Someone who values history, and I'm a Christian, so I do find it fascinating. The whole, I'm not the only one. There's a genuine interest in conclave now. Not just because of the Ralph Fiennes film. I think in recent years we've seen a number of you know, nods to popular culture. I would sort of look back to Angels and Demons, based on the Dan Brown novel. And then we had the two popes, Anthony Hopkins and Jonathan Pryce. I thought that was very good Netflix production, actually. Um, what else? There was the Young Pope, which I didn't really watch, but it had Jude Law. So there's a lot of interest in this. And why not? I mean, the position of Pope, the Bishop of Rome, the Vicar of Christ, it's not just any clerical position. He, and it will always be a he, is the spiritual head of 1.2 billion people. It's not an exaggeration to say that it's one of the most powerful and influential jobs in the world. I don't think that's an exaggeration because even, somewhat forgettable popes are still in a position of great power. Francis certainly will not be forgettable. I think he will be among the more remembered popes. Um, and I think there is genuine affection for him. Today we're going to see the state funeral. I'll probably watch it. Um, Already there's lots of people lining up for the lying in state. I know he wanted things to be a bit more modest, but it's going to be a bit difficult, I think, to totally grant that. I know he'll be buried in, I think it's called St. Mary Marta, something like that. It's a basilica outside the main St. Peter's Basilica, and it's the first pontiff to be buried there in so many hundred years. Francis was a trailblazer in many ways. He was a first in many ways. He was, of course, famously first pope from the New World, an Argentine by nationality. Um, he was the first pope to take a single name, like a unique name that is, since antiquity. Every other pope in the last millennium has been following on from names of other popes. So he was the first to have a unique name. Not the only, there were some in the early years, but the first in over a millennium. He was the first Jesuit pope. Um, and he is also a pope that I think has been very, very reforming. Now, did Francis get everything right? No. Um, but I think on balance, with the position that he had, given it's a position he didn't actively campaign for. And an interesting thing, actually, in the last conclave, he wasn't even named as one of the preferiti, or the papability to give a more formal title, that is to say, the favourite cardinals. I've just been looking over newspapers from that time, and they had the little segment on who could be the next pope. He wasn't even named. So that's why all the speculation right now, interesting as it is, could be way off. I wouldn't be surprised if at the end of this conclave they name someone that's a total surprise, that no one's heard of. I'm just going to read out a little bit from the Times obituary. I'm not going to read it all because it's extensive, but this is the Times obituary on Pope Francis. Well, first of all, this is the cover the other day. You may wonder why I haven't made this video up until now, because I wanted to read this first, that's why. There's 6, 7 pages of coverage. There's some of the referees that are being speculated on, but I'm going to make a separate video on that, just about the direction of the church and so on. This video is going to be mostly about Francis and what I feel is his legacy. Anyway, the obituary, I'm just going to read out a bit from this. Like I say, this is going to be very abridged. I'll try to hold this in one piece. Yeah, it's a bit hard to hold 2 pages at once. Anyway, here we go. I'm going to just read out some segments which I think is significant. Pope Francis was famous for a sense of humor, and it starts off here. This is their little byline. South American Pope who brought a freewheeling spirit but angered traditionalists in the church. The morning Pope Francis realized that the Swiss guard outside his bedroom had been on duty all night. He invited the soldier to share breakfast. But I'll be fired, stammered the guard. And who is your boss? The Pope said. And that was very much his informal sort of style. I couldn't see Benedict XVI doing that. Benedict XVI, incidentally, is the only Pope I've seen directly. I was in Rome in 2007. I had a disposable camera. He was giving mass, and he's a little red pixel up in the balcony. My father also was at an event which he attended when he made his visit to the United Kingdom. Um, it's worth pointing out, this is just my words, that when Francis came in, he could have been overshadowed because the fact that Pope Benedict XVI had resigned wasn't an unparalleled event. It had happened, as he said, played by Anthony Hopkins in the two popes. You know, there is a precedent. Pope Celestine V, I think, done it in 1296, but it was a very unusual event. So people weren't really sure how to respond to that. I'm sure a lot of um, the Curia had a bit of a headache over that one, but in the end, he became Pope Emeritus Benedict, and in the end, Francis, far from being overshadowed, he became. I remember in late 2013, there was a bit of a Francis phenomenon going on. He addressed a massive rally in Manila, 5 million people. In 2015, he addressed a huge rally in Kinshasa, I believe, the following year, about 1 million people. He was also the first pontiff to preach in the Arabian Peninsula, which is significant. Okay, here's some other things I just want to read out. Um, let's see. The homeless found a friend in Francis, who installed chairs for them in St. Peter's Square and found a barber to offer free haircuts. Um, when his biopic Chimatemi Francesco, Call Me Francis, was released in Rome, the Pope invited 7,000 refugees and homeless people sleeping rough to the premiere. That was always something that he'll be remembered for, I think, his genuine compassion for the poor. I'll come back to that. Um, but I want to make this balanced, you know, I don't want to just give a blind eulogy here. Um, he was very progressive on gay issues, I mean, by papal standards, so much so that even Sir Elton John praised him. Um, matters reached a crux, this is regarding the divisions in the church, with the publication in 2016 of Amoris Laetitia, The Joy of Love, written by Francis at the conclusion of a two-part synod discussing the modern family. An early draft had shown unexpected warmth toward the LGBT community. More revolutionary still was a phrase on gay relationships. Without denying the moral problems connected to homosexual unions, it has to be noted that there are cases in which mutual aid to the point of sacrifice constitutes a precious support in the life of the partners. And he famously said in an interview, "Who am I to judge?" Even gave the green light for bishops to bless homosexual unions. There was a lot of things that Francis done that rattled conservatives. I'll come back to that. I just want to touch on a slightly more controversial side. Divisions aside, Francis's informality surprised constantly. Just after his election, he called, well, this is just the whole paragraph. He called his newspaper vendor in Buenos Aires to cancel his subscription over the phone. He also called survivors of sexual abuse by priests to apologize on behalf of the church. One call, which surprised the survivor who was in his car, prompted the first big investigation into clerical abuse in Spain. Francis roundly condemned paedophile clergy in Father, I Forgive You, a book written by Daniel Coutet, a French survivor of clerical sexual abuse. How can a priest at the service of Christ and his church cause so much harm? Some of the victims have been driven to suicide. These deaths weigh on my heart and on my conscience, Francis wrote. However, suspicion that some accusations constitute gossip occasionally blinded his judgment. In 2016, five Argentinian priests accused Bishop Gustavo Sancheta of authoritarianism, financial mismanagement, and sexual abuse at a seminary in the Diocese of Oran. Sancheta appealed to Francis, who gave him a desk job at the Vatican while he travelled to Spain for psychotherapy. I'm not sure if that's talking about Francis or Sancheta. March 2022, Sancheta returned to Argentina for a court case and subsequently began a 4-year prison term after being convicted of the continued and aggravated abuse of two seminarians. Even Francis's fans sometimes cringe at a style of leadership that at times appeared crass or at best insensitive and thoughtless. He put his foot in his mouth repeatedly. He upbraided his irresponsible and astonished Philippine mother of eight for having so many children. Often Francis excoriated Catholics for gossip, a sin he compared somewhat surprisingly to terrorism. Calumny was his reply to journalists who asked him about a promotion of a Chilean bishop who had been accused of protecting a paedophile cleric. Within hours, Francis had apologized to those who had survived abuse at the hands of Father Fernando Paradima. He dispatched the Archbishop Charles Scicluna, that's Scicluna, to Chile and New York to interview Caradima's victims. The subsequent 2,300-page report led Francis to make a public apology, saying he had been gravely mistaken in my judgment and perception of the situation. He invited three Chilean survivors of abuse by Caradima to Rome to apologize to them face to face. I was part of the problem, he admitted, to the men's surprise. All 34 Chilean bishops were summoned to Rome and tendered their resignations to him. So he could show times that he could also take robust leadership in that sense, and he was humble enough to admit his mistakes. Um, there was times he did lock horns with the conservative faction in the Curia. For example, there was a shortage of priests in the Amazon region of Brazil, and I've just want to find this bit actually. Um, and his response to it was to allow married priests to take the roles, but they pushed back against that. Another thing that I respect Francis for is that he really pushed hard. I forget what papal bull it was, but he pushed hard to allow divorced people to receive communion. Now, honestly, at things like that, I think the Catholic Church can seem really out of touch with the modern world and can just seem frosty. I mean, I think even many Catholics recognize that's just cold. That just doesn't make sense. And you won't find anything in the Gospels um, that will, where Christ said anything of the sort. It's just that sort of puritanical stuffiness that the church can sometimes come out with. The Anglican Church is a bit better, but not a great deal better. But yeah, the Catholic Church is one thing. I think Francis recognized it. Yeah, it would be wrong to say that he was so revolutionary that he completely went away from theological teaching. So, for instance, he never went so far as to say he approved of homosexuality. He said, "Who am I to judge?" And he said that if it's a loving relationship, it shouldn't be a crime. But he did regard it as sinful. So, he could have he was not so revolutionary that he was, would totally separate himself from some of those positions. He also disapproved of abortion, so he never really went away from that area. Um, His distaste for global capitalism emerged in Laudato Si, his 2015 in encyclical on the environment. Fears that he favoured left-wing politics were not allayed by a visit to Fidel Castro. When Americans accused him of pure Marxism, Francis brushed this aside. The ideology of Marxism is wrong, he said, but I have met many Marxists in my life who are good people, so I don't feel offended. He had a very unorthodox background. He once served as a bouncer in Buenos Aires. Famously, as featured in the film The Two Popes, he had quite a difficult time in Argentina, and he was even accused of pandering to the military junta there. But that's a little bit unfair, because it later emerged that he directly appealed to General Fidela, who was the military dictator at the time, to release two of his Jesuit priests. And Francis personally, whilst not publicly denouncing the junta, he personally did actually protect people from its oppression. He even gave a man who apparently was a lookalike a passport to the Uruguayan border. So Francis, it would be wrong to say that he was totally apathetic and he'd done nothing in those years, the dirty war in Argentina. But obviously he felt some guilt about that. He did feel that he could have done more, and he was kind of pushed out of the Jesuits for a time. But the thing about Pope Francis, and this is the takeaway that I would say about him. There's a lot more to say, and I'm not done yet. But I just say this before I overlook it. When we look at inspiring leaders, when we look at people to admire, we shouldn't seek perfection. We shouldn't seek people who have never made mistakes. Francis did make mistakes. He wasn't perfect. He could be a little bit blunt at times. He um, perhaps could even be naive at times. He wasn't necessarily an academic theologian in the way that Benedict XVI was, but I honestly believe that the affection is well deserved. I think he was a fundamentally good man, and I, as a non-Catholic, admired Pope Francis. I think if if the true measure of a man is to live a full life, to come full circle, to be modest about your mistakes, to rise to a position of prestige and use that to help um, some of the most vulnerable people in the world, if that's a mark of greatness, then I consider Pope Francis a great man. Um, One of the celebrities who was coming, I'm trying to remember who it was actually, she said that he reminded her of Pope Leo the 23rd back in 1958 to 1963. He had a short pontificate, but a significant pontificate. He was sometimes known as the smiling pope. He was a big man, a big jolly man, and he was a reformer as well by the standards of the time. Famously, he presided over Vatican II. In fact, John the 23rd is so well respected that he's known as the good pope. And I think at time Francis will be as well. He famously, washed the feet of prisoners. He really did carry out what he saw as Christ-like, a Christ-like ministry. And if the head of the Catholic Church can't do that, then what's the point? Because Francis didn't see it as all about pomp and ceremony, and I personally do think that's important. That human traditions have a place as part of our culture, but Francis eschewed a lot of that, not to the point where he totally disregarded it. But for instance, he insisted on paying his own bill at the hotel on the night that he'd been elected Pope rather than, getting some secretary to do it. He would insist on wearing his regular priest's shoes as Bishop of Buenos Aires. Um, his work on the homeless and the poor was not just for the cameras, this was something he maintained throughout his life. That's sincere. Um, I think when it came to Russia and Ukraine, he got that wrong. He called for peace and he condemned the war. I think he did make a serious mistake in looking at it as a neutral situation. So in world politics, I think he could be a bit naive at times. I think that was one example. He just saw it as sort of, you know, I did see some memes depicting Pope Francis as a Russian puppet. I think that was a bit unfair. However, he was naive to see it as a sort of two warring parties, and to effectively tell the Ukrainians to give up. That's ridiculous. I've condemned Trump for that, and I think Pope Francis was wrong about that as well. Um, Likewise, on China, he didn't do enough to stand up to China, in my opinion. There were some brave elderly cardinals in Hong Kong who were persecuted, not cardinals, actually, bishops, who were persecuted by the Chinese regime. Francis could have been a lot more outspoken on that. He did make early overtures to improve relations with Beijing. Beijing, of course, didn't pay that any heed. Francis could have been a bit more robust, I think, on that area, a bit more outspoken. He could have been more outspoken on the persecution of Uyghurs and indeed the persecution of Christians there. But to his credit, and I do give him credit for this, without fail, he called the one Christian church left in Gaza every single day to ask how they were. And he didn't just ask for the Christians, he asked for everyone, for the Muslims, for everyone affected by Israel's onslaught. Interestingly, Israel sent out condolences like a sort of public statement, and they withdrew it, even though the Pope was very clear in condemning anti-Semitism. So this is typical of Israel. You either play by their book 100% or it's not good enough. But he was very explicit in condemning anti-Semitism. He, I think he was right to condemn what was happening in Gaza and to show solidarity with the Palestinians. The Times, in their main report, they criticized him for disregarding how the war began. Well, I would point out that the Times is disregarding the massive civilian suffering in Gaza as a direct result of Israel's military actions. This is just in the op-ed here. In diplomacy too, Francis failed to understand the trade-offs needed to pursue justice in a fallen world. In an interview last year, he called on the government of Ukraine to negotiate an end to the war with Russia. The Ukraine was demonstrably the victim of unprovoked aggression, and the Kremlin would thereby reward it for its crimes. True. Similarly, no, it's not similar. That's why I disagree with the Times. He urged for peace in Gaza, while skating over the reasons for conflict, the barbarous assault by Hamas on Israeli civilians and reservists, and the consequence need for Israel to strike back. The Times ignores just the extent of suffering that's going on there. One thing I really have a problem with some of the British more right leaning publications is their total disregard for Palestinian suffering. I do think there's double standards there, but anyway, that's for another video. Um, I'm really trying to put everything into this because there's so much to say. And no doubt I will have passed over something, but I think on balance, yes, Francis made mistakes. Some of his positions in global politics were misguided at best. But I think for the fact that he showed genuine compassion to some very vulnerable people, that definitely warrants respect. That's something I think should be seen in the papacy. Francis also recognised that it needed to get itself into the modern world. It needed to show a more compassionate face on issues like divorced Catholics and homosexuals and so on. Now, for some people, Francis didn't go far enough, but remember, in any position of leadership, there is balancing acts involved. Be too radical and you polarize people too much. Be too passive and you're seen as weak. So I think France has done his level best in some of those areas. And that's why I do think he will go down as one of the stronger popes, one of the more memorable popes. Now, I'll be making a separate video on the conclave, what I want to see happening. Um, I'll just say right now, I hope that whoever follows him follows in his doctrine. They don't need to be far left or something like that, but I think compassion has to be, it has to be at the heart of papal teachings, because if it isn't, then it's not Christ-like. It's not copying in the ministry of Jesus Christ. Compassion was at the core of Christ's teachings. And I think sometimes the Catholic Church can appear very stuck on dogma and forget its origins, actually. Um, like I say, there's nowhere in the Gospels, as far as I know, that says anything about refusing divorced people the communion. That's just there's a lot of Catholic doctrine that's been formed over the centuries that I think is a bit too stuffy and needs to be disregarded, or if not disregarded, at least eased down a bit. I mean, other institutions have had to do it. The monarchies had to reform. The British monarchy was very stuffy for a long time. In the 1960s, there was a number of reforms that was featured in the Crown. For example, debutantes weren't seen as like divorced debutantes couldn't meet the monarch, things like that. Well, if the British monarchy, 1,000 years old, could get rid of some of those things, the papacy, 2,000 years old, can maybe start to do it as well. Because that's how it's going to survive in the modern world. I think if it doesn't, if they go for an ultra conservative, it would be a big mistake, in my opinion. That's for the next video. Anyway, rest in peace, Pope Francis. You will be missed. You were an inspiration, and I think you will go down as definitely one of the more memorable popes, for sure. Um, and the world is poorer without him. In a world with Putin, Trump, Xi Jinping, the loss of Pope Francis is a sad thing. Um, Let me know your thoughts, especially if you're a Catholic.